My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 27 years old, and the first time my parents told me I had 2 days to get out of the house my grandparents left behind, I didn't cry or argue. I stood there, holding a cold coffee mug while my mother spoke in that soft, reasonable voice she used when saying something cruel. My father stood beside her, already certain of victory. My sister smiled like the ending belonged to her. They said the house should go to the daughter building a real future. Friday, 2 days. Leave the keys. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had already seen them clearly. In his final weeks, he rewrote everything, placing the house into an irrevocable trust and naming me sole trustee, the one who stayed when things were hard. I helped him sign it. I kept it quiet. So on Friday, when they opened the wall safe expecting deeds they could control, they found proof instead. Legal documents, his recorded voice. A sentence that ended them. They tried to fight. Court exposed the truth. The judge upheld the trust. I went home that afternoon, not victorious, just steady. I didn't save the house because I was ruthless. I saved it because I stayed.
They wanted a reaction. Tears, anger, something they could later twist into proof that I was unstable, emotional, unfit. But I had already learned the difference between reacting and preparing. While they were busy drafting my exit, I was remembering the quiet afternoon in a brick law office near the marina, where my grandfather sat straighter than he had in months and signed the papers that would change everything. He knew exactly what they were waiting for. He said so, calmly. He wasn't protecting money. He was protecting the house from becoming money. Upstairs in the study, they barely entered unless they were counting value. The wall safe held more than documents. It held signatures, dates, a notarized trust transferring the house into my care, a recording of my grandfather's voice, steady and clear, explaining why he made that choice, and a single sentence written for anyone who opened it expecting to take something. So when I nodded and said okay to their deadline, it wasn't surrender. It was timing. They thought Friday would end me. Friday was going to introduce them to proof. While my parents talked about fairness and family legacy, the truth was simpler and uglier. They saw the house as leverage. To them, it wasn't the place where my grandmother slowly forgot the names of flowers she once planted with pride, or where my grandfather sat through long evenings pretending he wasn't afraid of being the last one left. It was coastal property, appreciating value, a clean solution to financial pressure they never admitted out loud. I was the one driving back and forth from graduate school, memorizing pharmacy schedules, organizing pillboxes, arguing with insurance companies, paying heating bills online at midnight. I was the one who knew which floorboard creaked near the pantry and how to reset the old breaker when storms rolled in. And still, when they gave me 2 days to leave, they called me selfish. That was the real conflict. Not paperwork, not inheritance. It was the difference between showing up when things are inconvenient and showing up when something becomes profitable. They hadn't been absent by accident. They had been waiting for grief to finish its work so they could begin theirs. By the time they stood in my kitchen setting deadlines, I already understood something that changed me. When people feel entitled to what you've protected, they will rename your boundaries as cruelty. They will call your refusal betrayal. If you've ever been labeled selfish simply for refusing to surrender what you work to protect, pause for a moment and ask yourself, who was there when it was hard? That answer usually tells you everything. My grandfather was not a dramatic man. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he observed. And in the last year of his life, after my grandmother's memory began dissolving in small, cruel pieces, he observed everything. He saw who came because they were needed and who came only when it was convenient. He saw who stayed for the long silences after doctor visits and who stayed just long enough to take a photograph near the hydrangeas. He saw the difference between presence and performance. 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, I was helping him into bed when he held my wrist a little tighter than usual. His voice was calm, but there was something sharpened beneath it. "They think I don't know what they're waiting for," he said. He didn't have to explain. We both knew. My parents weren't waiting for recovery. They were waiting for conclusion, for paperwork, for transfer.
grief did something to him. It didn't make him weaker. It made him precise. When he asked me to drive him to see an estate attorney, he framed it as routine housekeeping, but I knew him well enough to recognize when he was minimizing something important. The law office sat near the marina, brick exterior, brass handle polished from years of use. The attorney, Ethan Rowe, wasn't flashy, no oversized desk, no framed magazine features, just neat stacks of files and a yellow legal pad filled with tight handwriting. I waited in the lobby at first, then Ethan opened the door and asked me to join them. My grandfather was sitting upright, more alert than I had seen him in months. There was no confusion in his eyes, only decision. He explained that years ago the will had left everything to my father under the assumption that family would behave like family. That assumption no longer felt safe. What he wanted now wasn't revenge, it was insulation, protection from pressure, protection from urgency, protection from exactly the kind of 2-day ultimatum I would later receive. Ethan laid out the structure carefully, an irrevocable trust. The house would be transferred into it. I would be named sole trustee. I would have the legal right to live there and preserve it. Selling or leveraging it would not be simple, and it certainly would not be something anyone could bully me into signing away. Every safeguard was deliberate, every clause was intentional. This isn't a reward, my grandfather told me. It's protection. I remember whispering that they would hate me for it. Ethan didn't even look up when he replied. They'll hate the boundary, not the truth. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. The documents were signed that afternoon, notarized, witnessed, recorded properly. My grandfather's hand trembled slightly, from age, not doubt. And before we left, Ethan suggested something else, an audio statement, a recording confirming that my grandfather understood exactly what he was doing and why. Weeks later, in the quiet of the study, my grandfather recorded it. His voice was thinner than it once had been, but steady. He said he was not confused. He said he knew who had been there. He said the house was meant to be preserved, not liquidated. He said he chose the granddaughter who stayed. There was no anger in his tone, just clarity. After he passed, I finalized everything with Ethan. We transferred the property into the trust officially, filed every document, double-checked every signature, and then we did something strategic. We said nothing. Ethan believed that if my parents thought I was unprotected, they would reveal their true intentions more openly. He was right. Pressure exposes character faster than comfort ever will. That was when I prepared the safe. The wall safe upstairs had always fascinated my family. They treated it like a vault of hidden treasure, so I placed inside it exactly what needed to be found: a notarized copy of the trust, Ethan's confirmation letter, the audio recording on a flash drive, and one single sheet of paper written plainly enough that it couldn't be misunderstood. If you are reading this because you came looking for something to take, then you already know why you were left out. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't theatrics, it was alignment, paperwork matching reality, evidence matching behavior. By the time my parents handed me their deadline, everything was already secured. The protection wasn't emotional, it wasn't dependent on anyone's goodwill. It was structured, documented, sealed. And the most important part wasn't that I had legal control. It was that my grandfather had seen the truth before I was forced to defend it.
The 2 days between their ultimatum and Friday felt like living inside a quiet performance. Every movement had to look believable. Every box I taped shut had to sound final. I packed winter coats into cardboard containers, wrapped dishes in newspaper, stacked books in uneven piles, like someone preparing for a reluctant move. I carried everything into the guest room and left the door half open, just enough for anyone passing by to see what looked like surrender. At the same time, I was doing something very different. I backed up emails, I exported text messages, I forwarded copies of every exchange to Ethan. I created folders labeled by date, by sender, by subject. If they wanted to turn this into a story about my instability, I was going to respond with timestamps. Wednesday morning, my mother called in a syrupy voice and asked if I had found somewhere to stay. She said she was worried about me being alone. In the same breath, she reminded me not to take the antique silver because it was family property. I saved the voicemail. My father called later, using that controlled tone he reserved for negotiations. He said dragging this out would embarrass everyone. He said adults should handle things privately. I wrote down the time of the call and summarized it in a document before the details blurred. Chloe didn't bother pretending. She texted me a photo of a renovated white kitchen and wrote, "This would look amazing once the house feels younger." Younger. I stared at that word longer than I expected. To her, the place where our grandmother forgot our names was simply outdated decor waiting to be refreshed. Thursday night, my mother showed up with a paper bag of pastries from a bakery I used to love in college. She wore a cream coat that looked expensive and stood in the doorway asking if we could act like adults. She spoke about stress, about Chloe's upcoming wedding,
about sacrifice. She said maybe I was making this harder than it needed to be. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. When she finished, I said I was tired and closed the door gently. Every interaction confirmed what Ethan predicted. They were not negotiating with me as family. They were maneuvering around an obstacle. Friday arrived under a flat gray sky. They came just before 5, right on schedule. My father asked for the safe key. I told him it was where it had always been, in the top drawer of the study desk. My voice didn't shake. I followed them upstairs, but stayed a step behind. The study smelled like cedar and old paper. Chloe leaned over my father's shoulder as he turned the dial. My mother stood by the window, arms folded tight. The safe door clicked open. For a brief second, there was silence. Then my father pulled out the top sheet and read. I watched the color drain from his face before he even reached the second paragraph. My mother stepped forward, took the documents from him, read faster, then slower. Chloe grabbed the flash drive, confused, irritated. "What is this?" she asked, but her voice had already thinned. My father opened my grandfather's letter last. He didn't speak while he read it. He didn't need to. That was the moment the air shifted. Confidence collapsed into calculation. Calculation collapsed into fear. "What did you do?" my mother asked. I met her eyes and answered. I followed instructions. They left 10 minutes later without another threat, without another deadline. The performance was over. And for the first time that week, I didn't have to pretend to be losing.
I knew the safe would shock them. I didn't expect it to unravel them. The phone call started before they even reached the end of the driveway. My mother called 6 times in 10 minutes. When I didn't answer, the voicemails began. First breathless, then sharp, then pleading again. "Naomi, don't file anything else. Call me before you talk to the lawyer. We can fix this as a family." The word family sounded different now, thinner, urgent. By Saturday morning, the pressure shifted outward. In a town like Stone Mill Point, reputation travels faster than truth. 2 acquaintances texted me asking if I was really trying to take everything. A woman from church wrote that my mother was devastated and just wanted peace. I almost admired how quickly the narrative had been repackaged. Concern instead of control, harmony instead of access. But Ethan had warned me, when documents are strong, the attack moves to character. So instead of responding emotionally, I built structure. I printed every voicemail transcript. I saved every message. I organized Chloe's texts, including the one where she mentioned hosting an engagement dinner at the house before listing it in the spring. Listing it. There it was in plain language. Not preserving, selling. Then Sunday night, she made the mistake that changed everything. A message meant for my mother landed in my phone instead. "If she doesn't cooperate, tell Dad to push the dead angle. She'll fold if she thinks everyone will know why we need the sale." She unsent it seconds later. Not fast enough. Dad angle. Until that moment, I had suspected urgency. Now I understood it. This wasn't about fairness or Chloe's future. It was about financial pressure my father had been hiding. Ethan confirmed it carefully, legally. There were tightening bank lines, business losses, personal exposure. The house wasn't sentimental to them. It was liquidity. Once I saw that, every interaction rewrote itself in my mind. The 2-day deadline, the insistence on avoiding embarrassment, the push for shared management. They weren't trying to protect me from mismanaging property. They were trying to regain access to something they could convert into relief. The civil petition arrived Monday afternoon. They claimed my grandfather had been too frail to understand what he signed. They implied I manipulated him during his decline. It was the cleanest way to attack the trust, discredit the caretaker. It stung, not because I doubted the outcome, but because of how easily they placed that version of me on paper. Ethan filed our response the same day, calm, precise, documented. The conflict had shifted from family argument to legal exposure, and somewhere in that shift, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but into clarity. They thought pressure would make me fold. Instead, it revealed exactly why my grandfather had acted when he did. By the time the hearing arrived, I wasn't afraid of losing the house. I was afraid of hearing my parents describe me as someone I wasn't, and realizing how easily they could say it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. It smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. Nothing dramatic, just quiet tension layered under polite voices. Their attorney painted me exactly as planned, emotionally compromised, isolated in grief, incapable of responsibly managing a valuable property. My mother dabbed at her eyes before facts were even introduced. Chloe sat between them in pale blue, composed and wronged. My father looked restrained, but I could see the strain under it. Then Ethan stood. He didn't argue emotion, he argued sequence, dates, signatures, care logs, pharmacy records with my name, travel receipts, repair invoices, the nurse's written statement confirming I had been the only consistent family presence during my grandparents' decline. He didn't claim I loved them more. He demonstrated that I showed up more. When my grandfather's recorded voice played in that courtroom, clear, steady, unmistakably aware, something inside me settled. He stated plainly that he was protecting the house from those who saw it as money. He stated he chose the granddaughter who stayed. But the real shift came when motive surfaced. Chloe's email about listing the house, the text about the debt angle, the subtle financial pressure my father tried to downplay. Layer by layer, urgency turned into exposure. And then my father said it, that they only needed me to stop being selfish long enough to sign so the family could stabilize things. In that sentence, the mask fell. The case was never about protecting me. It was about controlling me. And once that truth stood in open court, it didn't need embellishment. It only needed to be heard.
When the judge delivered her ruling, she did it without drama. No raised voice, no theatrical pause, just clarity. The trust was valid. The challenge was denied in full. I was confirmed as the lawful sole trustee of the house. There was no credible evidence of manipulation. The documented record overwhelmingly showed that I had been the primary caregiver and responsible steward of the property. Then she addressed something even more important. She criticized my parents' attempt to pressure me into vacating the home before any legal determination. She ordered them to pay a substantial portion of my legal fees, and she placed a 2-year civil restriction barring them from entering the property or contacting me outside formal legal channels unless I agreed in writing. It wasn't just a legal win. It was a boundary enforced by law. My mother cried then, real tears this time, but they weren't for me. They were for the loss of control. Chloe looked stunned, like consequences were a language she had never been forced to learn. My father said nothing as he walked out. What I understood in that moment was simple and permanent. Boundaries feel cruel only to people who benefited from you having none. The law did not protect me because I was emotional or persuasive. It protected me because I had documentation, structure, and restraint. Compassion brought me to the house. Evidence allowed me to keep it. I drove back to Stone Mill Point the same afternoon the hearing ended. The road felt different. Not shorter, just lighter. For weeks, every mile had felt like I was driving toward confrontation. That day, I was simply going home. The house looked the same as always, stone walls steady against the wind, the porch railing worn smooth by years of hands resting on it. Nothing about it announced victory. It didn't need to. Inside, the silence felt familiar instead of heavy. I stood in the foyer for a moment, coat still on, letting the quiet settle around me. Then I walked into the kitchen and set the kettle on, reaching automatically for my grandfather's chipped ceramic bunk. I took my tea to the back porch, where the late afternoon light stretched across the boards. The garden swayed gently beyond the steps. For a moment, I expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. What I felt was steady, clear, like something tight inside my chest had finally loosened. I hadn't saved the house by fighting louder than they did. I saved it by staying when staying was hard. Sitting there on the porch, I realized something I hadn't understood when this began. Blood makes people related. It does not automatically make them safe. It does not guarantee loyalty, and it certainly does not guarantee love that shows up when things are inconvenient, exhausting, and unprofitable. For years, I confused endurance with obligation. I thought being patient meant absorbing everything quietly. I thought keeping peace meant sacrificing pieces of myself so no one else felt uncomfortable. But peace built on surrender is not peace. It's slow erasure. What saved me wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I learned that kindness without boundaries becomes permission, that love without documentation can be rewritten by whoever speaks loudest, and that protecting what you've cared for, whether it's a home, a memory, or your own dignity, is not selfish.
that's responsible. I used to wait for my parents to become the version of themselves I hoped existed underneath the control and performance. Letting go of that hope hurt, but it also set me free.